This little piece of clay is packed full of information from 4,200 years ago. The language of the inscription is Sumerian.
Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of a written record that we have.
There is a basement beneath the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology that smells like old clay, old paper, and old time. It is not a dramatic place. There are no grand pillars, no ceremonial lighting. Just shelves, fluorescent bulbs, and thousands of clay tablets pressed with tiny wedge-shaped marks that most human beings on Earth cannot read. For most of the 20th century, one man spent more hours in that basement than almost anywhere else on Earth. His name was Samuel Noah Kramer. And before he died, he said something that should have shaken the academic world to its foundations. He said, "We have been reading these tablets, but I am no longer sure we have been understanding them." To appreciate why those words matter, you first have to understand who Samuel Noah Kramer actually was, not in the abstract sense, but in the very specific, concrete, career-defining sense. Born in 1897 in Zashkov, in what is now Ukraine, Kramer immigrated to Philadelphia with his family as a young child. His path to scholarship was not straightforward. He explored several academic directions before landing, almost accidentally, at the University of Pennsylvania, where he earned his doctorate in Oriental Studies in 1929, specializing in Mesopotamian languages. It was not the most glamorous field in the world. Sumerian studies in the 1920s was a niche discipline practiced by a handful of specialists in a handful of universities. Most people in 1929 could not have told you what a Sumerian was. That was about to change, largely because of Kramer. His career took a decisive turn in 1930 when he joined an archaeological expedition to Iraq. That experience ignited his lifelong dedication to Sumerian studies. He began working with clay tablets in museums in Istanbul. He contributed to Assyrian dictionary projects in Chicago. And then he came home to Philadelphia and spent the next 6 decades doing something that had never been done on such a scale before. He translated ancient Sumer for the modern world. The scale of this achievement is difficult to overstate. Thorkild Jacobson, a Sumerologist at Harvard University, said Kramer completely transformed, almost created, the field. That is the kind of assessment colleagues offer at funerals, and they usually exaggerate. In Kramer's case, it was barely enough. Kramer wrote 30 books and numerous articles for both the general public and the academic world. His 1956 book, History Begins at Sumer, introduced millions of ordinary readers to a civilization most had never seriously considered. It is the classic account of the achievements of the Sumerians, who live in what is now southern Iraq during the 3rd millennium BC, developers of the cuneiform system of writing, perhaps their greatest contribution to civilization, which allowed laws and literature to be recorded for the first time. The book presented a cross-section of Sumerian firsts in all the major fields of human endeavor, including government and politics, education and literature, philosophy and ethics, law and justice, agriculture and medicine, even love and family. The first recorded love song, the first formal school system, the first legal precedents, the first pharmacopoeia, all of it traceable back to one civilization in the marshland of ancient Mesopotamia, and all of it made accessible to the modern world through the translations of one man. When archaeologists anywhere in the world dug up cuneiform tablets and needed someone to tell them what those tablets said, the tablets came to Kramer. He was, in the truest sense of the phrase, the bridge between the ancient world and the modern one. Without him, an enormous portion of humanity's earliest recorded thought would have remained locked behind a script nobody could read. But here is the thing about bridges. They require you to stand in the middle, between two worlds. And the longer you stand there, the more clearly you begin to see that the two worlds on either side are not as similar as you once assumed. The doubts did not arrive suddenly. They accumulated. Slowly, over decades, in the footnotes of academic papers and the margins of translations, a quiet discomfort grew in Kramer's work that his colleagues preferred not to examine too closely. If you go back and read Kramer's published papers from the 1960s and 1970s with genuine attention, not skimming, but reading, you begin to find the same phrases appearing with increasing frequency. Phrases like, a particular word has no exact English equivalent, or the concept here is difficult to render in modern terms, or the precise meaning of this passage remains uncertain. At first glance, these look like routine scholarly hedging. Every translator acknowledges gaps. No ancient language maps perfectly onto modern English. But the hedges were becoming more substantial. And by the 1980s, they had begun to take on a different character. Kramer had started to wonder whether the difficulties of translation were not merely linguistic, a matter of finding the right English word for a Sumerian term, but something deeper and more troubling. Something structural. Something that went to the heart of what translation even means when two civilizations are separated not just by language but by entire frameworks of thought. The Sumerian language presented a specific and remarkable challenge in this regard. Scholars of the ancient Near East had long recognized that the conceptual vocabulary available to ancient Mesopotamian peoples was fundamentally different from ours in ways that mattered. The ancient world had no word that resembled supernatural. That concept, the idea of a realm operating outside or above the laws of nature, did not exist as a distinct category. There is no such word as religion in the languages of the ancient Near East. Likewise, there is no dichotomy between sacred and secular, or even between natural and supernatural. Read that again slowly. These are not small omissions. Religion, supernatural, sacred, secular, these are the organizing categories through which the modern world has always interpreted ancient belief systems. We look at Sumerian texts describing their gods and their cosmology, and we instinctively reach for these categories because they are the ones we have. But those categories did not exist for the Sumerians, which means that when we use them to interpret Sumerian texts, we are not translating Sumerian thought. We are replacing it. Kramer began to understand this with increasing urgency as he aged. The Sumerians had a word for what we translate as God, the cuneiform sign called Dayar. The concept of divinity in Sumerian is closely associated with the heavens, as is evident from the fact that the cuneiform sign doubles as the ideogram for sky, and that its original shape is the picture of a star. The original association of divinity is thus with bright or shining presences in the sky, not gods in the Greek or Roman or modern monotheistic sense, not beings who exist in a separate spiritual realm and intervene in human affairs from outside. Something more immediate, something woven into the physical world itself. Kramer had been translating Dayar as God his entire career. Every scholar did. It was the accepted convention. But conventions, as Kramer was learning the hard way, can be invisible prisons. Before we get to the specific crisis that broke Kramer open in his final years, it is worth pausing on one detail of Sumerian civilization that has always demanded a more satisfying explanation than the one we typically give it. The Sumerians used a number system based on 60. Not 10 the way we do. Not 12, which has been popular in various cultures. 60. This system originated with the ancient Sumerians in the 3rd millennium BC, was passed down to the ancient Babylonians, and is still used in a modified form for measuring time, angles, and geographic coordinates. Every time you glance at a clock and see minutes divided into 60 seconds, or look at a compass divided into 360 degrees, you are using a Sumerian invention. The standard explanation for why they chose 60 is that it is mathematically elegant. The number 60 can be divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30 equal parts. That makes it vastly more flexible than base 10 for calculations involving fractions, which matters enormously when you're trying to measure land, track planetary cycles, or divide harvests. Historians of mathematics have offered many opinions on this question without any coming up with a really convincing answer. The elegant divisibility argument is true, but it seems, as one mathematician observed, to scholarly a reason, the kind of rationale you construct after the fact rather than one that would naturally motivate the original choice. What is more interesting is what the Sumerians actually did with this number system. The Sumerians were the first civilization to develop a counting system of this sophistication, and the echoes of their base 60 system can still be heard today. We divide an hour into 60 minutes and a minute into 60 seconds, a direct legacy of their sexagesimal system. Their astronomical records, tracking the movements of planets and stars across decades and centuries, achieved precision that European astronomers would not match until the Renaissance. The question Kramer had started asking quietly in private was whether the astonishing intellectual achievements of early Sumer reflected not just clever observations but a different relationship to pattern and number altogether. Whether the precision was not painstaking accumulated data but something more immediate, a way of perceiving relationships in the world that the modern mind has to reconstruct laboriously through mathematics, but which the Sumerians may have simply seen. He could not prove this. He was not sure it was even expressible in modern terms. But it nagged at him. and it connected to everything else that was beginning to nag at him about the translations he had spent his life producing. To understand what Kramer was grappling with, it helps to know something about where the text he translated came from. The ancient city of Nippur, known in Sumerian as Nibru, was one of the great religious and intellectual centers of the ancient Mesopotamian world. It was never a political capital in the normal sense. No great dynasty was founded there. No emperor made it his seat of power. But for thousands of years, it was understood by the Sumerians themselves to be the spiritual center of their world, a place where the god Enlil, lord of wind and storm and cosmic order, maintained his earthly home. Nippur is where most of the literary tablets that define our understanding of Sumerian civilization were found. The great myths, the hymns, the laments, the wisdom literature, the texts that Kramer spent his career translating, largely came from scribal schools in Nippur, where generations of students laboriously copied and recopied the canonical texts of Sumerian culture onto clay. The tablets that Kramer held in his hands in that Philadelphia basement were school exercises, student copies, homework assignments from 4,000 years ago. Think about what that means for translation. You are reading not the original composition but a copy, often a copy of a copy, made by a student who may not have fully understood what he was writing. The Sumerian scribal tradition was deeply conservative. Accuracy of reproduction was valued above all else. But no copying process is perfect, and no student, however diligent, brings identical understanding to a text that their teacher brings. Over centuries of copying, what might have been lost? Kramer thought about this constantly. And the more he thought about it, the more he believed that something had been lost, not in the copying process, but in something much larger. Something that had happened to human civilization itself. Sumer, the earliest known civilization, emerged during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Ages between the 5th and 4th millennium BC in the historical region of southern Mesopotamia, in what is now south-central Iraq. At its height, it was an extraordinary achievement. Cities of tens of thousands of people, complex bureaucracies, sophisticated agriculture, monumental architecture, and the world's first writing system. All of this emerging, in historical terms, with remarkable speed, a burst of organized complexity that still puzzles archaeologists. And then it ended. There was a major depopulation of southern Mesopotamia from about 2000 BCE, leading to the collapse of Sumerian culture. The causes were multiple. Because no written accounts explicitly mention drought as the reason for the Sumerian demise, the conclusions rely on indirect clues, but several pieces of archaeological and geological evidence tie the gradual decline of the Sumerian civilization to a drought, not a single summer or winter, but 200 to 300 years of drought. The agricultural productivity of the Sumerian lands was also being compromised as a result of rising salinity. The evaporation of irrigated waters left dissolved salts in the soil, making it increasingly difficult to sustain agriculture. The UR3 Empire was overrun around 1950 BC by Elamites and nomadic Amorites invading from the east, a disaster memorialized in haunting Sumerian laments. All of this is understood. The political and environmental story of Sumer's collapse is reasonably well documented. What troubled Kramer was something the archaeological records suggested but nobody wanted to say out loud. The late Sumerian texts were different, not just in content, different topics, different concerns, but in a quality of thought that was hard to name and harder to dismiss. The early Sumerian texts operated at a level of abstraction and cosmic scope that later texts did not match. The great creation myths, the hymns to Inanna, the laments for destroyed cities, these were not simple documents. They encoded ways of thinking about time, causation, and human experience that sat uneasily alongside the administrative records and legal codes that increasingly dominated later cuneiform production. It was as though the civilization was becoming more practical and less. What? Less something. Less whatever the early Sumerian mind had been capable of that produced the great cosmological texts in the first place. The famous Sumerian king list told a similar story in its own peculiar way. Early kings in that list are credited with reigns of tens of thousands of years. Al-Ulam of Eridu reigned for 28,800 years, according to the text. Later kings have increasingly normal lifespans. The standard interpretation is that this represents a transition from mythology to recorded history, early legendary figures gradually giving way to real historical persons. Kramer had accepted this explanation for most of his career. Toward the end, he was less certain. What if the dramatically long reigns were not mythology at all, but a record of something the Sumerians understood about time, existence, and the nature of rulership that we no longer have the conceptual vocabulary to grasp. He could not answer these questions, but he had reached the point where he could no longer pretend they were not being asked. In 1988, in his early 90s and approaching the final months of his life, Kramer returned to a tablet he had first translated nearly 40 years earlier. It was a text from Nippur, containing a dialogue between human and divine figures, discussing knowledge, civilization, and the origins of human capacity. He had published his translation in the late 1940s. It fits smoothly into the established narrative. The gods of Sumer had granted civilization to human beings as a gift from above. The Sumerians were a theocratic people who believed all wisdom descended from divine sources. Case closed. Except that Kramer, sitting with the tablet in those final weeks, began to look again at the specific Sumerian words he had chosen to render in English, and to ask, for the first time with genuine urgency, whether his English renderings were translations or assumptions. The Sumerian language is notoriously polysemantic. Many of its most important words carry multiple, layered meanings that do not collapse neatly into single English equivalents. This is not unusual for ancient languages, but it is particularly pronounced in Sumerian, partly because the writing system, cuneiform, was not originally designed for Sumerian at all but adapted from an earlier proto-writing system. The result is a language in which context governs meaning to an extraordinary degree, and in which a translator who brings modern assumptions to the text will consistently find confirmation of those assumptions in the words, because the words are flexible enough to provide it. What Kramer was beginning to confront in those final months was the possibility that he had been doing exactly this for 6 decades. Not dishonestly, not carelessly, but inevitably, because he was a 20th century scholar trained in 20th century categories trying to read documents produced by minds that operated within a completely different framework of thought, and the gap between those frameworks was larger than he had ever been willing to admit. The colleagues he showed his revised thinking to were not receptive. The academic investment in the existing translations was enormous. Dissertations had been written, textbooks published, careers built on interpretations that Kramer was now calling into question. The response was what it usually is when someone tries to reopen settled questions in academia: dismissal dressed as concern. Sam is getting old. Sam is being too philosophical. Sam needs to rest. But Kramer was not being philosophical. He was being precise. He was saying, with the authority of someone who had spent more time with these texts than almost any other human being alive, I'm not sure I understood what I was reading. And I'm not sure any of us do. Samuel Kramer died on November 26, 1990, at his Philadelphia home of throat cancer. He was 93. His obituary noted that he had completely transformed, almost created, the field of Sumerology. It celebrated his translations, his books, his decades of tireless scholarship. It did not dwell on the doubts he had articulated in his final years. The academic establishment moved on efficiently. The translations stayed in the textbooks. The interpretations remained standard. The framework he had helped to construct, and had then quietly, urgently begun to dismantle, stayed intact. This is how academic knowledge works. It is not entirely cynical. Institutions need stability. Curricula need consensus. Students need to be taught something rather than told that everything is uncertain. The practical pressures that keep established interpretations in place are real, and they are not always driven by bad faith. Sometimes they are driven simply by the enormous inertia of accumulated knowledge, the sheer weight of what has already been built on top of the foundations being questioned. But there is a cost to that stability. The cost is that the questions Kramer was raising at the end of his life, questions about the limits of modern translation, about the gap between ancient and modern frameworks of thought, about what we might be systematically failing to understand in the oldest written records our species possesses, those questions did not go away just because the textbooks did not update. They are still there, sitting in the clay. Here is what makes Kramer's late-life reckoning genuinely important, rather than merely interesting. It is not a conspiracy. There is no suppressed revelation. There is no secret knowledge being kept from the public by shadowy academic gatekeepers. What there is something subtler and in some ways more unsettling: the recognition that the tools we use to understand ancient thought are themselves products of the modern thought we are trying to see beyond. When we translate a Sumerian text about the nature of the world, we use English words. Those words carry meaning shaped by Greek philosophy, Roman law, Christian theology, Enlightenment science, and 2 centuries of industrial modernity. The ancient world had no word that resembled supernatural, but the moment we pick up a Sumerian text about the divine and reach for our category of religion, we have already made a choice that shapes everything we see. We have put the Sumerian world inside a box it never occupied and called the result a translation. This is not a solvable problem in any simple sense. We cannot step outside the minds we have. We cannot think in Sumerian the way a Sumerian thought. The categories that structure our perception are not something we can simply set aside by deciding to. The best we can do is what Kramer eventually understood he had not done enough of, to sit with the strangeness of ancient texts, resist the impulse to make them familiar, and ask whether the difficulty of understanding them might itself be information. The Sumerians produced, in an astonishingly short period of historical time, the first system of law, the first formal educational system, the first love song, the first pharmacopoeia, and the first recorded literature. Their astronomical observations were precise enough to remain useful for millennia. Their mathematical system, built on base 60 rather than base 10, divided the movements of the heavens into countable intervals in ways that we still use every time we check the time. Their irrigation systems transformed a floodplain into the most productive agricultural region the ancient world had ever seen. And then it ended. After around 2000 BC, ancient Sumerian gradually died off as a spoken language in the region. For the next 2,000 years, the tongue lingered on as a dead written language, similar to Latin in the Middle Ages, but has been completely extinct since then. The civilization that produced all those first vanished, leaving behind only what they pressed into clay, and a legacy so fundamental to subsequent human civilization that, as one reader of Kramer's history begins at Sumer put it, we are all, in a sense, Sumerians. Kramer spent 60 years reading what they pressed into clay. And in his final years, he came to believe that reading those marks and understanding those minds were two different things. That the act of translation, however meticulous, however expert, might be systematically obscuring something important about how the people who wrote those marks experienced and understood the world they lived in. He did not know what that something was. He was not sure the modern mind was equipped to know. And that perhaps is the most important thing he ever said, not a confident revelation, but an honest confession of the limits of what translation can achieve when the gap between two civilizations is not merely linguistic but cognitive, not merely historical, but something harder to name. Before I die, please listen. We have gotten this wrong, not the details, the whole framework. The academic establishment may have moved on efficiently after Kramer's death, but the questions he raised have not moved on. A growing body of work in the fields of cognitive archaeology, the history of consciousness, and the anthropology of ancient thought has continued, quietly and without much public fanfare, to examine precisely the issues Kramer identified, whether ancient civilizations thought in genuinely different ways rather than simply less sophisticated versions of modern thought, and what it would mean for our self-understanding if the answer turned out to be yes. This is not the fringe territory of alternative history enthusiasts. These are serious scholarly questions being asked by serious scholars, and they remain unresolved. The tablets are still there. The cuneiform is still pressing through the clay in museums and archives from Philadelphia to Istanbul to Baghdad. We can technically read the marks. The question that Kramer, dying, wanted desperately to leave behind is whether reading is enough. The man who spent more time than almost anyone else alive building the bridge between ancient Sumer and the modern world died believing the bridge was shorter than the gap. That the distance between what the Sumerians pressed into clay and what we understand when we read it is wider than our translations have ever admitted. That somewhere in the space between those two worlds, something vital is lost, not through dishonesty or negligence, but through the simple, unavoidable fact that every act of understanding is also, inevitably, an act of translation. And translation is always, always a loss. Samuel Noah Kramer knew Sumer better than almost any human being who ever lived. And at the end, what that knowledge had taught him was humility. The rarest and most important conclusion any scholar can reach. The tablets are still there. The questions are still open. And if Kramer was right, the thing we most need to understand about the beginning of human civilization is also the thing we are, for now, least equipped to see.